This is part two of my section on the concept of stratification. So in this section, I'm going to talk about or try to answer the question of how does stratification work? And it has always been my argument that the best way to understand Deleuze and Guattari's concepts is by asking the question, how do they work? In order to understand strata and the idea of stratification, I think we have to go back a step and think a bit more about what kind of a problem does it answer. And some people would see this as a problem of emergence. I'm less inclined to see it that way, but rather to see it as a problem of relationships. So in the chapter on the geology of morals, Deleuze and Guattari talk about what they call the first principles. And these first principles are the questions and issues that we have to deal with before we can really get to the idea of strata. And they say that there are four first principles. So in this segment, I'm going to talk about those four first principles and try to put them into context for you. And that context being the context of Deleuze and Guattari's work. So in the beginning, in Deleuze and Guattari's ontology, if you like, or in their metaphysics, there is a chaos of unformed and unstable matters that flow freely as so many kind of mad particles, or what they also term intensities. And this is the first of the first principles that the geology of morals alerts us to. Now, they do not specify what types of particles they have in mind, but it soon becomes clear that they are referring to every variety of particle imaginable, from specks of sand and dust to the ephemeral kernels of ideas and feelings that we also call desire. And one of the real difficulties of reading the Geology of Morals chapter is the fact that it operates on three distinct levels all at the same time: the geological, the organic, and what I call the techno-semiological, or we could just simply think of as the human, and only minimally signpost the fact that these three levels are in fact separate domains. And one of the key things that I argue in all of my work on the assemblages is that we really do need to pay attention to the fact that Deleuze and Guattari treats the three main forms of strata as radically distinct. Now, this also means that the particles it refers to can be both material and what we might think of as immaterials, or virtual, if you like. A thought or an idea may well be the product of physical processes, but it remains intangible in itself because it lacks an extensive material form. And this just adds another layer of confusion because it makes it seem that there is no difference in kind between the different types of particles, which is in fact untrue and is not consistent with their model of the three separate realms of strata. Now, it is true that Deleuze and Guattari say that semiotic fragments can rub shoulders with chemical interactions and so on, but this is only possible, as they specify, on the plane of immanence, or what they also call the plane of consistency. And it is only possible because, and here I'm quoting, they have been uprooted from their strata, that they have been destratified or decoded and deterritorialized. And so that's the only way by which they can all exist on the same plane. It is tempting to think that the geological and organic strata Deleuze and Guattari discuss function as a kind of ramp to work our way up to the technological stratum, but this would imply that the geological and the organic are precursors and that they are somehow less evolved or less complex in the techno-semiological model, which Deleuze and Guattari also refuse to say. And that the techno-semiological stratum could somehow encompass within it the other two, which they similarly reject. So it's crucial to bear in mind that they are very clear in saying this, that there is no evolution from the geological to the biological to the techno-semiological. One may function as the substratum of the other, or what we might also think of as the necessary condition, but it is not the sufficient cause of the other. The fact that we are humans, that as humans we are organic beings dwelling on a large rock, in no way explains what we humans do, and ultimately it is what we humans do that is the central focus of Deleuze and Guattari's schizoanalysis. To put it even more bluntly, neither geology nor biology is our destiny. Now, this does not mean that there is no place for the more than human or the other than human in Deleuze and Guattari's work. Obviously, that's completely not true. Deleuze and Guattari were early pioneers of the kind of work in the humanities and social sciences that today focuses on the more than human and the other than human domains. However, it is also the case that the majority of what Deleuze and Guattari have to say refers only to the techno-semiological stratum of humans. And this is simply a fact, and you can verify it for yourself through your reading. But the deeper theoretical point I want to make here is that we need to keep in mind the fact that because each stratum is differently organized, we cannot mobilize the operations of one to explain the operations of the other. To put it very simply, rocks don't explain proteins, and proteins don't explain identity politics, and identity politics doesn't explain proteins, and proteins don't explain rocks. So we have to be careful not to fall into the trap of analogy, which is a constant risk with Deleuze and Guattari's work, because their terminology seems to push us in that direction. The moment we start studying plant biology in order to better understand the rhizome, we have succumbed to the fallacy of correspondence between the strata and engaged in analogical thinking. One stratum may be part of the explanation of what happens on another stratum. There can be no doubt that our physiology, which is the biological stratum, has an effect on our psychology, which is the techno-semiological stratum. Our mood is clearly affected by what we eat, by the things that we do, and indeed by the ground beneath our feet, which is the geological stratum. But that does not mean that studying the interactions of blood cells under a microscope can in any way help us to understand mood or other formations of human desire. Again, putting it very simply, fascism is not in our blood. A scientific analysis of the ocean cannot explain why many of us find it calming to spend time near the sea. The rhizomatic principle that everything can and should be related does not mean that everything is related, nor that it is related in the same way, or more importantly, related on the same plane. And remember, it is only on the plane of immanence and the plane of consistency that everything can be related. So one of the crucial things you need to think about with respect to the concept of the rhizome is that it really only operates on the plane of immanence. So as we move from the geological and biological strata to the techno-semiological strata, we move from a swirling soup of material particles to a swirling soup of immaterial particles or intensities. Now, intensities go by many names in Deleuze and Guattari's work. For example, affects and becomings are the two most important, but they all have one thing in common. They lack extension. Unlike the other varieties of particles that I have mentioned, they do not have a tangible material thing-like or object form, or even a proper name like love or hate. Intensities are the agitations of the mind and body, for the want of a better way of putting it, that move us in an emotional, spiritual, or libidinal sense, but we cannot name. They are the stirrings in our mental equilibrium that come before love and hate, anger and frustration. They are the sensations we long to sustain when we're on a high and cannot wait to escape or extinguish when we're stuck feeling low. So Deleuze and Guattari refer to the universe of these nameless agitations of the mind and body as the earth, but also as the body without organs and the plane of immanence. But it is perhaps simpler for us to see it as a spatialized image of desire in its pure state. Now, this is not the desire of individuals or even of groups of individuals. It lacks all such specificity. It is rather desire in general. Desire as it flows through all of us, that is simultaneously more than us and us at our constitutive core. It is desire conceived as plenitude, not lack. It is a formulation of desire that needs to be understood in terms of the things it is capable of creating, and not, as Lacanian psychoanalysis would have it, as a drive towards objects it can never obtain. Desire creates then by creating assemblages, and these assemblages may become so naturalized that we forget that they are assemblages and mistake them for the primary functioning of desire, which is effectively what Deleuze and Guattari say happened to Freud when he decided that the Oedipal complex explained the central functioning of desire. But as Deleuze and Guattari demonstrate in Anti-Oedipus, both Freud's model of Oedipus and Lacan's model of lack both presuppose what they should explain, and that's the real problem that they have with them. So desire has the potential to be destructive, to carry us away, to drop us in a black hole. So we need to interrupt it, to capture it, to manage it, and to put it to work. And this brings us to the second of the first principles, which follows directly from the first principle. And Deleuze and Guattari say this: there simultaneously occurs upon the earth a very important, inevitable phenomenon that is beneficial in many respects and unfortunate in many others, stratification. End of quote. So stratification then is the process which consists in giving form to matters by, and again I'm quoting, imprisoning intensities or locking singularities into systems of resonance and redundancy, and thereby creating molecules on what they call the body of the earth. This is then the core presupposition upon which the psychoanalytic project rests. Desire is a free-flowing stream of intensities subject to processes of capture and what we might think of as coagulation, which give rise to and constitute the entire world. Stratification is the process whereby the apparent nothing of chaotic particles circulating without order becomes the evident something that is life as we know it and all that that entails. The concept of stratification is obviously borrowed from geology, but we should not assume that that means Deleuze and Guattari are proposing a geological explanation of everyday life. And even when they use the term geophilosophical, we should not assume that we can just simply go to geology to find our explanations. Nor is it simply a vibrant form of matter. Stratification borrows two key ideas from a thoroughly destratified version of geology, both of which are helpful as we navigate Deleuze and Guattari's deployment of this concept. Firstly, they assume that we can and should separate the world into distinct layers, but we could just as easily say distinct phyla, according to the origin of their formation, i.e., not everything happens at the same time. Things have a beginning and an end, and while one thing may precede another, it is not necessarily its precursor or progenitor. Secondly, we can and should inquire into the variations that occur between and within layers. And again, the same would apply to phyla. But we should not assume these variations follow a prescribed pattern or plan. Layers imply both the convergence of matter over time and, just as crucially, the prolonged absence of or resistance to processes of disruption and divergence. As such, stratification is ultimately a problem of consistency, how a strata formed and what holds them together. Now, as we've seen, Deleuze and Guattari stipulate that there are three main classes of strata: geological, biological, and techno-semiological. The latter breaks down into subclasses of strata, of which three are particularly important: the organism, signifiance, and subjectification. In actual fact, though, there is no limit to the number of strata so long as one is able to satisfy two essential requirements. One must be able to demonstrate the unity and logic of composition of a strata, and secondly, define the limits of the composition, where it begins and where it ends. And this is, in geology, this is straightforward as any core sample from the Earth can tell you. Providing there hasn't been a major geological disturbance, the layers of rock formed at different periods of the Earth's history will be clearly distinct. But it is much less straightforward on the other strata. On the techno-semiological strata, for instance, the lines of separation will tend to be blurry. So, for example, try to draw a distinction between surrealism, modernism, and postmodernism. And what one finds is that there is a great deal of continuity between those three artistic movements, even as we want to try to say that there are significant differences as well. So Deleuze and Guattari also stipulate that there is no implied hierarchy or order of development in the relation between the three main classes of strata, or indeed that any of the strata that we may identify. The first refers to the formation of the physical geography of the Earth itself, specifically the transformation of sediment into rocks by means of aggregation, heat, and compression. The second refers to the formation of organic life, the transformation of single-cell organisms into the amazing range of complex creatures that populate the Earth today. And the third refers to the formation of socialized life, which largely, though not exclusively, means human society. And this is why we don't really need to pay too much attention to the science, and certainly we don't have to treat it as though it will explain everything for us, because neither of the first two classes of strata involve socialized life. Therefore, neither are amenable to philosophical inquiry or analysis in their own terms. Not only that, the mechanism that Deleuze and Guattari put together to explain the process of stratification is drawn from linguistics and not biology or geology. Any philosophy then that we might generate concerning the geological or biological strata is inescapably of a different order from the techno-semiological stratum. It can only ever be a philosophy of what sentient life forms happen to think and feel about those orders of being. As Deleuze and Guattari put it, science is the translation of the flows, particles, codes, and territories of the other strata into a sufficiently deterritorialized system of signs, in other words, into language. The three strata differ in terms of their organization. So while there is a movement of matter between the strata, the schema of one stratum cannot be used to explain the schema of another. The steady accretion of sediment into rock can in no way explain human society except through some vague metaphorical or analogical manner. Neither the geological nor the biological strata can be used to explain the functioning of the techno-semiological stratum because their processes are different. If they use rhizomes, this is the biological, to explain certain types of psychological behavior, they do so by extracting, i.e. destratifying, several of this particular plant variety's traits, specifically the way it can branch or put down roots from any part of its body, but then use them in a new way. There is, however, no correspondence between rhizomes as it is understood in plant biology and as it is used in Deleuze and Guattari's psychology. A detailed study of the life cycle of ginger or turmeric is not going to tell you anything meaningful about schizophrenia. Likewise, a detailed study of schizophrenia is not going to tell you anything meaningful about the life cycle of ginger or turmeric. This may seem obvious when it's put like this, but there is an amazing amount of secondary work on Deleuze and Guattari that follows precisely this analogical principle. The point then is that the difference between each strata is a difference of kind, not degree. The step change between them means the three strata are literally incomparable, except in the extremely abstract sense that Deleuze and Guattari use. The key difference between them is this: whereas the geological and the biological strata are spatial in their organizational makeup, the techno-semiological is both spatial and temporal. In contrast to the genetic code, for instance, language is superlinear, not linear. It can also emit, receive, comprehend, and translate code, which the genetic code cannot. And again, I'm quoting from Deleuze and Guattari. They say the temporal linearity of language expression relates not only to a succession, but to a formal synthesis of succession in which time constitutes a process of linear overcoding and engenders a phenomenon unknown on the other strata, namely translation. Translatability, as opposed to the previous inductions, geological and transduction. So end of quote. In other words, it's really, really important that we recognize that Deleuze and Guattari 100% are advocating that the three different strata do not relate to each other directly. One does not explain the other, one does not behave in the same way as the other, and one is not formed in the same way as the other. If we go back to thinking about language, the meaning of a phrase or sentence cannot be arrived at additively. And this is something that you can learn by trying to translate any kind of poetry in a language you don't know by using a dictionary. One cannot simply add the meanings of individual words together in order to arrive at a meaningful whole. And one cannot know the meaning of a sentence or phrase until one has heard it in its entirety. We may be able to guess where a sentence is going, and obviously autocorrect and autofill on our smartphones and computers try to do this, but with varying degrees of success. But even allowing for the built-in redundancies of syntax and grammar, we cannot know with absolute certainty where a particular sentence or phrase is going to end up. What we call wit, for example, or humor, is simply an exploitation of this aspect of language, the surprise ending, the surprise twist, the pun, and so on. All of these things are possible and they're funny because language functions in a superlinear way, not a linear way. For this reason, on the techno-semiological stratum, expression is independent of both content and substance, which is not the case for any of the other strata. Similarly, translation is only possible on the techno-semiological stratum. Now, this brings me then to the third of the first principles, which is this. Stratification is a process of capture, which works by means of coding and territorialization, which are the two main processes of the concept of the assemblage. And again, they draw on Helmsleb here in order to construct a working diagram of this process. Stratification, they say, has two basic processes, which are themselves dual processes that happen in succession. And I'm going to deal with this in more detail in my next segment, but I'll leave it there for now because it's about to get seriously technical.